Rachel Parker thought she had all the time in the world, until she didn't. When her father, a beloved police officer, is diagnosed with terminal cancer, she refuses to let fate steal their most precious moment, their father-daughter dance. What happens next is a breathtaking story of love, loss, and one final promise that will stay with you forever. Where are you watching from? Share in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories that touch the heart. Rachel Parker had always been a daddy's girl. Some of her earliest memories were of sitting on the front porch with her father, James Parker, watching the sun dip behind the city skyline as he sipped his coffee and told her stories of the streets he patrolled as a police officer. In his crisp uniform, badge gleaming under the porch light, he was larger than life, a hero not just to the people he protected, but to the little girl who idolized him. Rachel's mother had died in a car accident when she was just 7. The loss had been sudden, brutal, leaving behind a hole in their lives that no one else could fill. But James never let grief swallow them. Instead, he devoted himself entirely to Rachel, raising her alone with an unwavering sense of purpose. He learned to braid her hair before school, attended every parent-teacher conference, and never missed a dance recital, even if it meant coming straight from a night shift, exhaustion weighing heavy in his eyes. Every Sunday morning, without fail, they had breakfast at Tony's Diner, where the waitress always knew their order: pancakes for her, black coffee and eggs over easy for him. It was their sacred ritual, a promise that no matter how chaotic life became, they would always have that moment together. As Rachel grew older, she saw her father not just as a protector, but as a man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. His job as a police officer meant he saw the worst of humanity: violence, loss, the kind of darkness that crept into his soul and never truly left. But he never let it touch Rachel. At home, he was just Dad, the man who made her laugh with his terrible dad jokes, who danced with her in the living room to old Frank Sinatra records, who taught her to drive in an empty parking lot on a Sunday afternoon. She wanted to make him proud, and in everything she did, she carried his lessons with her. When she decided to become an ER nurse, he had beamed with pride. "You got my instinct to protect people," he told her, ruffling her hair. "Just like your old man." She met Ethan Carter during one of her overnight shifts at the hospital. He was a trauma surgeon, brilliant, steady under pressure, with a kindness in his eyes that immediately drew her in. Their first conversation had been over a vending machine that refused to give up its last bag of pretzels. Rachel had slammed her fist against it in frustration, just as Ethan had walked by. "Want me to perform an emergency extraction?" he'd joked. She had laughed, and something about the way he looked at her made her heart beat just a little faster. Their love had been easy, effortless. Ethan understood the long hours, the emotional toll of the job. More than that, he understood her. When they weren't at the hospital, they spent hours walking along the riverfront, talking about everything and nothing. On their first real date, Ethan had cooked for her, and while he might have been a genius with a scalpel, he was a disaster in the kitchen. The pasta had come out overcooked, the garlic bread burned, but Rachel had fallen for him anyway. She knew he was the one long before he ever proposed, but the way he did it was perfect. It was on a Sunday morning at Tony's Diner, with her father sitting right across from them. Ethan had been nervous, she could tell by the way he kept fidgeting with the napkin in his lap, and then, right in the middle of breakfast, he had turned to James and said, "Sir, I love your daughter more than anything. I want to spend the rest of my life making her happy. I'd like your blessing to marry her." Rachel had nearly choked on her coffee. Ethan had turned to her with a sheepish smile. "I was going to ask you later in a more romantic setting, but I realized something. This is your place, Rachel. You and your dad. And I want to be part of that." James had leaned back in his chair, scrutinizing Ethan the way he used to interrogate suspects in the precinct. A long silence stretched between them, the air thick with tension. Then, finally, he broke into a grin. "You better take care of my little girl," he said, extending his hand. Ethan grasped it firmly, sealing the deal. That night, Ethan officially proposed, dropping to one knee in their tiny apartment, the ring glinting in the dim light. Rachel barely let him finish the question before throwing her arms around his neck and saying yes. The wedding date was set for October 20th, a perfect fall wedding at a vineyard just outside the city. James had teased her about needing to start practicing his dance moves. "I don't want to embarrass you in front of all those guests," he'd said with a smirk, but no promises. In the months that followed, Sundays at Tony's became wedding planning sessions. James pretended to care about floral arrangements and cake flavors, though he always said the only thing that really mattered was that there was chocolate somewhere. He helped her pick the venue, argued good-naturedly about song choices, and most of all, he looked forward to their father-daughter dance. "That's my moment," he told her one morning, tapping his coffee cup against hers "I've been waiting for that since the day you were born." Life felt perfect, as if nothing could ever touch their happiness. Until the phone call that changed everything. Rachel was in the middle of a shift, adjusting a young patient's IV when her phone buzzed in her pocket. She normally ignored calls at work, but something about it made her stop. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. She answered, stepping into the hallway. "Miss Parker?" The voice on the other end was urgent. "This is Officer Gaines from the department. Your father collapsed at home. Paramedics are on the way." The world tilted. For a second, she couldn't breathe. "I'm coming," she said, already ripping off her gloves and running for the exit. The drive to the hospital felt like an eternity. When she finally arrived, she found James pale and weak in a hospital bed, an oxygen mask over his face. "Dad?" she whispered, gripping his hand. He opened his eyes and, despite everything, he smiled. "Hey, kiddo, you look stressed. Rough shift?" The doctor arrived before she could respond. The words were clinical, detached, but they slammed into her like a freight train. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, metastasized, no cure. 6 to 10 weeks at most. Rachel heard the words, but they didn't make sense. Not her father. Not the man who had always been her rock. This was supposed to be the happiest time of her life. He was supposed to be there in October, walking her down the aisle, spinning her around the dance floor. This wasn't part of the plan. James saw the devastation in her eyes and squeezed her hand. "It's gonna be okay, Rachel," he said softly. But for the first time in her life, she didn't believe him. Rachel sat frozen in the hospital chair, the doctor's words echoing in her mind like a nightmare on repeat. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, 6 to 10 weeks. How could this be happening? Just yesterday, her father had been teasing her about wedding cake flavors. Now he lay in a hospital bed, a thin plastic tube feeding oxygen into his body, his once strong hands resting limply on the sheets. James squeezed her hand, the same way he had when she was a little girl afraid of the dark. "I know that look," he said, his voice weaker than she'd ever heard it. "You're trying to figure out how to fix this." Rachel blinked rapidly, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. "There has to be something, Dad. A clinical trial, an experimental treatment, anything?" She turned to the doctor, searching his face for a sliver of hope. There's got to be something. Dr. Patel, the oncologist, sighed heavily, his eyes filled with the kind of sorrow that came from delivering this kind of news too many times. We can explore chemotherapy, but at this stage the cancer is aggressive. Treatment could extend his time by a few weeks, but it will come at a cost. His strength, his quality of life. James let out a soft chuckle. Well, hell. Sounds like a bad trade. Rachel turned back to him, her heart pounding. Dad? Don't say that. James reached for her, his fingers brushing over hers. Rachel, I don't want to spend my last days hooked up to machines, too weak to enjoy what time I have left. I've spent my whole life fighting battles. This one, I can't win. Rachel felt like she was suffocating. Her father had always been invincible. He had chased down criminals in dark alleys, pulled accident victims from wrecked cars, protected the city when others ran away in fear. How could he surrender now? She opened her mouth to argue, but he shook his head. No tears, kid. Not yet. Ethan arrived moments later, his expression carefully controlled, but Rachel could see the concern in his eyes. He placed a steadying hand on her shoulder before addressing James. Sir, is there anything you need? James studied him for a long moment, then smirked. Yeah, I need you to make sure my daughter eats something before she passes out from stress. Rachel let out a choked laugh despite the ache in her chest. Dad. Ethan squeezed her shoulder before turning to James. I can handle that. James looked between them, something unreadable in his gaze. Then, as if sensing Rachel's impending breakdown, he nodded toward the hallway. Why don't you two step out for a bit? I need a nap anyway. Rachel hesitated, but Ethan gently pulled her up. Come on, he murmured. Let's get some air. She let him guide her into the hallway, where the fluorescent lights buzzed too loudly. The second the door shut behind them, she felt her knees buckle. Ethan caught her, wrapping his arms around her as the sobs she had been holding in finally broke free. I can't do this, she gasped against his chest. He was supposed to walk me down the aisle. He was supposed to... Her voice cracked, and she clung to Ethan like he was the only thing keeping her upright. Ethan didn't say anything at first. He just held her, letting her cry. Then, when her sobs finally quieted to shaky breaths, he whispered, We'll find a way. Rachel pulled back, wiping at her eyes. There is no way, Ethan. Even if we move the wedding up, he won't be strong enough. Her voice wavered as she forced herself to say the words out loud. Even if we do it next month, he won't be able to walk me down the aisle. Ethan exhaled slowly. Then we bring the wedding to him. Rachel stared at him, uncomprehending. What? We bring the moment to him, Ethan said gently. He doesn't need to be at the church to see you as a bride. The idea hit her like a lightning bolt, lighting up the dark storm of grief that threatened to consume her. Her father had been talking about her wedding day since she was a child. He had joked about practicing his father-daughter dance moves. He had dreamed about walking her down the aisle. If he couldn't be there in October, she would make sure he saw her in that dress now. Rachel swallowed hard, her mind already racing. I need to find my dress. The next morning, Rachel sat at the kitchen table, her untouched cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. Across from her, Ethan watched her carefully, waiting for her to speak. Finally, she looked up. I want to do it, she said. I want to wear the dress for him. Ethan nodded as if he had known this was coming. Then we'll make it happen. She took a shaky breath. I don't know if it's crazy, but I just want him to have that moment, to see me as a bride before... Her voice caught, but she forced herself to continue. Before it's too late. Ethan reached for her hand. It's not crazy, it's beautiful. Rachel nodded, pressing her lips together. I need to find my dress today. Within the hour, her best friend Natalie had cleared her schedule to take her dress shopping. They arrived at Belle's Bridal Boutique, the bell over the door jingling as they stepped inside. The boutique owner, an older woman named Elaine, greeted them with a warm smile. Shopping for a wedding dress? She asked, her gaze flickering between the two women. Rachel hesitated, then nodded. Yes, but I need it fast. Something in Elaine's expression softened. How fast? Rachel swallowed hard. A few days. Elaine didn't ask why. She simply nodded. Let's get started. Dress after dress, Rachel tried them on, but nothing felt right. Too much lace, too plain, too extravagant. The minutes ticked by, and she felt the weight of urgency pressing on her chest. Then Elaine brought out one final dress. This one just arrived, she said. It's simple but elegant. Rachel stepped into the gown, the delicate lace settling against her skin. She turned to the mirror and, for the first time, saw herself as a bride. Behind her, Natalie sniffled. That's the one. Rachel barely recognized the woman staring back at her, not just because of the dress, but because of the realization that this wasn't for her. This wasn't about her wedding day. This was about her father. Elaine must have sensed it too. She cleared her throat. If you need it altered quickly, I'll make it happen. Rachel turned to her, gratitude making her throat tight. Thank you. Elaine smiled. Just promise me something. Rachel blinked. What? Take a picture with your dad in that dress? Elaine said softly. And bring me one. Rachel's chest constricted, but she nodded. I will. That night, as she sat beside her father's hospital bed, Rachel hesitated before speaking. Dad, she said softly, I went dress shopping today. James turned his head slightly, his eyes heavy with fatigue. Yeah? Did you find something? Rachel forced a smile. Maybe. James studied her for a moment, then exhaled. Your mom's dress was simple, he murmured. But she was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. Rachel's throat tightened. I wish she could be here. She is, James said, tapping his chest weakly. She's always here. Rachel nodded, her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. I want you to see me in my dress. James frowned slightly, confused. Well, of course I will, kid. Rachel hesitated, then whispered, No, Dad. I want you to see me. Now. For a long moment, James just looked at her. Then, understanding dawned in his eyes. Rachel held her breath, waiting. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, James said, I'd like that. Rachel barely slept that night. She lay awake in the small guest room of her childhood home, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft hum of the oxygen machine in her father's room down the hall. The rhythmic sound had become both a comfort and a curse. It meant he was still here, still breathing, but also served as a reminder that his time was running out. She turned onto her side, curling her hands into fists as the weight of reality pressed down on her. 6 to 10 weeks. It played over and over in her mind like a cruel countdown she couldn't escape. But she refused to waste time grieving what hadn't happened yet. He was still here. That meant she had time. Not much, but enough. At dawn, she rose quietly, throwing on a sweatshirt before heading into the kitchen. Carol, her father's longtime partner, was already there, sipping coffee at the counter, the exhaustion on her face mirroring Rachel's own. "You didn't sleep," Carol observed. "Neither did you," Rachel countered. Carol offered a tired smile. "There's too much to think about." Rachel poured herself a cup of coffee, staring at the swirling steam as if it might hold answers. "I need your help." Carol set down her mug. "Anything." Rachel took a slow breath, her heart hammering. "I want to wear my wedding dress for Dad. I want to give him that moment before it's too late." For a long second, Carol just looked at her. Then she reached across the counter and covered Rachel's hand with her own. "He's going to love that." Rachel exhaled, some of the tension in her chest loosening. I don't want to wait too long. We have to do it soon." Carol nodded, already slipping into a mode of quiet efficiency. "He's been having better mornings after his night meds. That's probably our best window." She hesitated. "But, Rachel, you need to be prepared. He might not be strong enough to stand. And if it's a bad day—" "I know." Rachel's voice was steadier than she felt. "We'll adjust. I just need him to see me." Carol gave her hand a squeeze. "Then let's make it happen." The next few days became a blur of preparations. Rachel reached out to her best friend, Natalie, who immediately cleared her schedule to help coordinate the surprise. Ethan handled the logistics with the photographer, while Carol discreetly monitored James's energy levels, tracking when he seemed most alert. Rachel had to be strategic. Every second counted. Her father's strength was fading faster than she wanted to admit. Some days he was awake and lucid, cracking jokes with his old squad members who came to visit. Other days he barely had the energy to speak. On Wednesday, Carol pulled Rachel aside after helping James back to bed. "Tomorrow," she said quietly. "He had a good morning today, but he's getting tired faster. If we're doing this, it needs to be soon." Rachel's stomach twisted, but she nodded. Tomorrow. That was it. That night, as she laid out the dress in the spare bedroom, she couldn't stop her hands from trembling. She ran her fingers over the delicate lace, thinking about all the times she had imagined her father walking her down the aisle. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She squeezed her eyes shut. "Don't think about what's being taken away. Think about what you're giving him." Taking a deep breath, she whispered, "I hope this is enough." The morning of the reveal dawned bright and warm. The kind of perfect spring day that should have been spent outside, laughing, living. Not counting down moments like grains of sand slipping through an hourglass. Rachel left early for her hair and makeup appointment, feeling an odd sense of detachment as her stylist worked. This isn't for my wedding. The thought kept circling in her mind. This is for him. Natalie arrived halfway through, holding a coffee in one hand and a bag of emergency supplies in the other. "How are you holding up?" Rachel met her best friend's gaze in the mirror. "Ask me in a few hours." Natalie squeezed her shoulder. "It's going to be beautiful." Rachel wanted to believe that. When they arrived at Belle's Bridal Boutique, Elaine, the boutique owner, was already waiting, the dress carefully steamed and ready. "Everything's perfect," she assured Rachel, "and I included a small handkerchief with your initials embroidered, just in case you need it." Rachel's throat tightened. "Thank you." Elaine smiled softly. "Go make a memory." Back at the house, Carol met them at the side door, her expression unreadable. "He's awake," she said quietly. "Sitting by the window, looking out at the garden. He doesn't suspect a thing." Rachel's hands clenched around the dress bag. This was it. Michael helped her into the gown in the guest room, his fingers careful as he adjusted the zipper. When she turned, he exhaled, shaking his head. "You look—" Rachel cut him off with a small, bittersweet smile. "Not yet. Not until he sees me." Michael nodded, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I'll be waiting." Natalie gave her one last once-over, smoothing a stray curl into place. "Ready?" Rachel inhaled deeply. "Yeah." Her heart pounded as she stepped into the hallway. This wasn't a wedding aisle, but it felt just as significant. She took slow, steady steps, her dress whispering against the floor. Carol stood near the living room doorway, her eyes already shining with unshed tears. She mouthed, "He's waiting." Rachel nodded and stepped inside. Her father was sitting in his recliner, a soft breeze drifting in through the open window. The sunlight cast golden streaks across his thinning hair. He looked up at the sound of her footsteps, expecting Carol. His expression shifted the moment he saw her. For the first time in her life, James Parker was speechless. Rachel barely made it 2 steps before his hand flew to his mouth. His eyes, still sharp despite the fatigue, went wide with disbelief. "Rachel," his voice cracked. "You—" Rachel swallowed against the lump in her throat. "I wanted you to see me, Dad." James blinked rapidly, as if trying to convince himself this wasn't a dream. Then, slowly, he held out his hands. Rachel crossed the room, sinking to her knees beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. He squeezed them, and though his grip wasn't as strong as it once was, it was still his. "You look—" He trailed off, shaking his head. His breath hitched. "Just like your mother." Rachel let out a soft, trembling laugh. "Is that okay?" His face crumpled. "It's perfect." He reached up, brushing his fingers against her cheek, his touch feather-light. "You always were the most beautiful thing in my life." Rachel clenched her jaw, determined not to break. This moment wasn't about her pain. It was about giving him something to hold on to. James exhaled shakily, a flicker of mischief breaking through his emotion. "I suppose now would be a bad time to tell you. I never actually practiced our dance." Rachel let out a watery laugh. "I guess we'll just have to wing it." Rachel's breath caught. "Are you sure?" James's gaze was steady, unwavering. "If this is my only chance to dance with my daughter in her wedding dress, I'm not wasting it." Carol and Ethan moved in immediately, helping James rise carefully from his chair. He was weak but determined. Rachel stood before him, waiting. The living room fell silent as Carol pressed play on the old CD player. The soft opening notes of "The Way You Look Tonight" filled the air. James let out a shaky breath. "Well, kid." He extended his hand, just as he had all those years ago when she stood on his shoes to learn how to dance. "May I have this dance?" Rachel placed her hand in his. Always. They swayed gently, barely moving, but it didn't matter. He was still holding her, still here. Tears slid down Rachel's face, but she smiled through them. As the song neared its end, James shifted slightly, gathering what little strength he had left. One last move. Rachel recognized it instantly. Their dip. Their signature father-daughter move. It wasn't the grand, dramatic dip he used to do when she was a child. It was barely more than a lean, but it was theirs. When the song ended, James sighed, exhausted but smiling. "That's my girl." Rachel kissed his cheek, whispering, "I'll carry this dance with me forever, Dad." And she knew, in her heart, she would. Rachel barely remembered the moment the song ended. The world felt suspended, like time itself had paused to make space for something sacred. Her father's breathing was unsteady, but his expression held something stronger than exhaustion. Peace. A quiet satisfaction, as if this moment had given him exactly what he needed. She stayed kneeling beside his chair, holding his hands, feeling the warmth of them, memorizing their roughness, their shape. For so many years these hands had lifted her onto his shoulders, patched up scraped knees, guided her first wobbly steps on ice skates. Now they trembled slightly in hers, the strength that had once seemed unshakable fading before her eyes. James exhaled slowly, looking at her with something unspoken in his eyes. "That," he murmured, his voice hoarse, "was worth every second I held on." Rachel's throat tightened. "You're not going anywhere yet, Dad?" He gave a weak chuckle. "Oh, sweetheart, we both know better." Rachel's jaw clenched. She hated how easily he accepted it, how he faced his own mortality with the same quiet determination he had always carried. But she also understood it. Her father had never been one to fight a battle that couldn't be won. Still, she wasn't ready to let him go. Carol stepped in, her touch gentle as she helped James back into his recliner, adjusting the oxygen tube he had stubbornly removed before the dance. His body sank into the cushions, his strength nearly spent, but his gaze never left Rachel. "You okay?" he asked softly. Rachel let out a shaky laugh. He was the one dying, and he was asking if she was okay. "I should be asking you that." James smirked. "I'm fine, kid. You know, for a guy whose lungs are staging a rebellion." Carol pressed a cool glass of water into his hands, and he took a slow sip before looking back at Rachel. "Come sit," he said, nodding toward the ottoman in front of him. Rachel obeyed, tucking her dress carefully around her legs as she sat before him, suddenly feeling so small again, like she was 7 years old, curled up on this same floor while he read her bedtime stories. James reached for something beside him, a small wooden box Rachel hadn't noticed before. It was old, the edges worn smooth by time. "I wanted to wait," he admitted, running a finger over the lid. "But I think now's the right time." Rachel frowned slightly as he handed it to her. The box was heavier than she expected. Her fingers brushed over the engraved initials on the top, J.P., the same letters her father had scribbled on paperwork, stitched into the inside of his police uniform. Slowly, she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a faded piece of cloth, was a simple gold wedding band. The metal was worn, dulled by decades of wear. Rachel inhaled sharply. "Dad?" James's voice was quiet but steady. "I want you to give that to Ethan." Rachel looked up, confusion flickering across her face. "But, Dad, this was yours." He nodded. "It was there on the best and worst days of my life." His gaze softened. "And now, I want it to be part of yours." Rachel swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the cool metal. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," James murmured. "Just promise me something." Rachel lifted her eyes to meet his. "When you put that ring on Ethan's hand," James said, his voice hoarse with emotion, Remember what it means. Love isn't just about the easy days, kid. It's about showing up on the hard ones. About holding on even when everything in you wants to let go. Rachel felt tears spilling down her cheeks. She nodded, gripping the ring in her palm, pressing it into her skin like an anchor. I promise. James exhaled, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Then, as if remembering something else, he reached back into the box and pulled out a sealed envelope. Rachel's breath caught the second she saw her name in her father's handwriting. "What's this?" she whispered. James hesitated before handing it to her. "For your wedding day." Rachel's hands shook slightly as she took the envelope, running her fingers over the ink. His words, his voice, preserved for a day he wouldn't be there to see. She clenched her jaw. "You could just tell me what it says now." James chuckled, shaking his head. "Nope. You open that when you're supposed to." His smile faded slightly, his eyes serious. "This is my way of walking you down the aisle, Rach." Rachel pressed the envelope to her chest, closing her eyes briefly. When she opened them, James was watching her with an expression so full of love, it nearly broke her. "I don't know how to do this without you," she admitted in a whisper. James reached out, touching the side of her face, his thumb brushing away a tear. "Yes, you do." Rachel shook her head. "You're the strongest person I know," he interrupted gently. "And I know I haven't always said it enough, but you make me proud, every single day." Rachel let out a soft, broken laugh. "You tell me that all the time." James smiled faintly. "Good. Then you'll remember it." She laughed again, but the sound was fragile, like glass on the verge of breaking. "I love you, Dad." James' grip on her hand tightened, just for a moment. "Love you more, kiddo." They sat there in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow across the room. The light caught on the wedding band in Rachel's palm, making it gleam. James exhaled slowly. "I think I need to rest now." Rachel nodded, forcing herself to smile. "Okay." Carol stepped in, guiding James to lean back against the cushions, adjusting the pillows behind his head. He sighed, closing his eyes briefly before cracking one open. "Rachel?" "Yeah, Dad." A small smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Tell Ethan I expect a damn good speech at the wedding." Rachel let out a choked laugh. "I'll make sure of it." James hummed in approval, his breathing steadying. Within minutes, he was asleep. Rachel stayed beside him long after the room fell silent, her fingers still curled around the wedding band and the unopened letter. She had given him his moment. And now, all she could do was hold on to it for as long as she could. The house was quiet that evening, except for the soft hum of the oxygen machine and the distant chirping of crickets outside the window. Rachel sat in the dim glow of the living room lamp, still wearing her wedding dress, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the delicate lace along the bodice. The fabric felt heavier now, as if it carried the weight of every emotion she had tried to keep at bay. Across from her, her father slept, his breathing shallow but steady, his features soft in the flickering light. The moment had been everything she had hoped for, and yet it hadn't been enough. Nothing ever could be. Carol entered the room, a warm cup of tea in her hands. She set it down gently on the side table and glanced at Rachel, her gaze filled with quiet understanding. "You should change," she murmured. "It's been a long day." Rachel didn't move. She just kept staring at her father, memorizing every detail. His silver-streaked hair, the deep lines in his face that had been carved by years of laughter, worry, and love. "Not yet," she whispered. Carol sighed, but didn't argue. Instead, she settled into the armchair beside her, folding her hands in her lap. "He was happy today," she said softly. Rachel let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Yeah," she murmured. "He was." Carol hesitated before adding, "I think that was the last thing he was holding on for." Rachel's throat tightened. "Don't say that." But Carol just shook her head. "You know it's true." Rachel did. She had felt it, in the way his body had leaned into hers during their dance, in the way his grip had faltered just before he let go. The moment had been beautiful, but it had also been a farewell. She pressed a hand to her face, exhaling slowly. "I don't know how to let him go." Carol's expression softened. "Then don't. Carry him with you." Rachel swallowed the lump in her throat. "It's not the same." "No," Carol agreed. "It's not." Silence stretched between them, comfortable and yet unbearably heavy. Finally, Carol squeezed Rachel's hand gently. "I'll sit with him for a while. Go get some rest." Rachel hesitated. But then, as she looked at her father one last time, she realized that Carol was right. He was at peace now. He had gotten his moment. She nodded, stood slowly, and disappeared down the hallway to change. Rachel barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she relived the moment her father had first seen her in her dress. His awe, his tears, the pride in his voice. It played on a loop in her mind, bittersweet and fragile, like a memory already slipping through her fingers. By morning, the house felt different, lighter somehow, quieter in a way that made Rachel's stomach clench. She knew before she even reached the living room. Carol sat beside James, her hand resting gently over his, her head bowed. The oxygen machine was still humming, but Rachel could tell the rhythm had changed. Slower, shallower, fading. Rachel's breath hitched. "Carol?" Carol lifted her head, her eyes rimmed red but calm. She gave Rachel a small, sad smile. "He's still here," she said softly, "but not for long." Rachel's knees nearly gave out. She rushed to her father's side, her heart hammering as she took his hand in both of hers. His skin was cool, his fingers limp but still familiar. His breathing was barely there, each inhale more labored than the last. "Dad," Rachel choked, squeezing his hand. "I'm here." James' eyelids fluttered, a flicker of recognition in his tired blue eyes. His lips parted, but no words came, only a faint smile, small but unmistakable. Rachel leaned closer, pressing her forehead to his knuckles. "It's okay," she whispered. "You can rest now." A long pause. A soft, final exhale, and then silence. Rachel stayed frozen, her ears straining, her heart refusing to accept what she already knew. Carol reached out, covering Rachel's hands with her own. "He's gone." The words shattered something inside her. Rachel sucked in a breath, but it came out broken. She pressed her forehead harder against her father's hand, her shoulders shaking as the sobs she had fought for so long finally broke free. She had known this was coming. She had spent weeks preparing herself, but nothing could have braced her for this. Carol rubbed her back, whispering soft words that Rachel couldn't hear over the roaring grief in her ears. Time lost meaning. Eventually, Ethan arrived. Rachel barely registered his presence until she felt his arms around her, grounding her. She buried her face against his chest, gripping the front of his shirt like it was the only thing keeping her from unraveling completely. "He got his moment," Ethan murmured into her hair. "And you gave it to him." Rachel nodded against him, fresh tears soaking into his shirt. That was the only thing keeping her together now, the knowledge that, in the end, her father had left this world with the memory of their dance still fresh in his heart. The days that followed felt surreal, like Rachel was moving through a fog, disconnected from reality. The funeral was held the following week, and the entire police force showed up to honor James. Officers from all over the city lined the streets, their uniforms crisp, their expressions solemn as they stood at attention. Chief Wallace, James' former partner, delivered the eulogy. His voice was steady, but his grief was evident. "James Parker spent his life protecting this city," he said. "But more than that, he spent his life loving his daughter. And in the end, that was his greatest legacy." Rachel sat in the front row, Ethan's hand wrapped tightly around hers, watching as her father was given a full police honor guard. The sound of bagpipes filled the air, followed by the folding of the American flag that had been draped over his casket. When the officer handed it to Rachel, she accepted it with trembling fingers, holding it close to her chest like a lifeline. After the service, as the crowd slowly dispersed, Rachel found herself standing before her father's grave, her fingers tracing his name on the headstone. She pulled the wedding band from her pocket, rolling it between her fingers. "I'm still giving this to Ethan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Just like you wanted." She swallowed hard. "I miss you, Dad." The wind stirred through the cemetery, rustling the leaves, carrying with it the distant echo of his voice. "You're the strongest person I know." Rachel closed her eyes, letting herself believe, just for a moment, that he was still with her. In the days leading up to her wedding, Rachel found herself clinging to the letter her father had left for her. She hadn't opened it yet. She wasn't ready. But knowing it was there gave her comfort. The night before the wedding, she sat on the edge of her bed, the envelope in her lap. The edges were slightly crumpled from how many times she had held it, traced her fingers over his handwriting. Ethan sat beside her, waiting patiently. "Are you sure you don't want to read it now?" he asked softly. Rachel exhaled, shaking her head. "No, not yet." Ethan reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Whatever it says, he's with you tomorrow." Rachel squeezed his hand. "I know." And for the first time since losing her father, she actually believed it. On the morning of her wedding, as she stood in the quiet bridal suite, dressed in white, she finally opened the letter. "My dearest Rachel, if you're reading this, it means it's your wedding day, and I'm not there. But that doesn't mean I'm not with you." Rachel's breath hitched, tears slipping down her cheeks as she read the words he had left behind. "Hold your head high, kid. Walk down that aisle like you own the place. And when it's time for our dance, don't be sad, because we already had our moment, remember? Our last dance, in the living room, with Unforgettable playing." That was enough for me. Rachel pressed the letter to her chest, closing her eyes. It would never be enough for her, but she would carry it with her. Always. Rachel stood at the entrance of the church, her fingers tightening around the bouquet in her hands. The soft murmur of guests inside, the distant strains of the piano playing the first notes of the wedding march. It all felt surreal. The moment she had spent months planning for was finally here, but instead of the overwhelming joy she had once imagined, there was a deep ache lodged in her chest. Her father's absence was a ghost that hovered over everything. Ethan had been right. Her dad was with her in every detail of this day. In the empty chair in the front row, reserved with his police cap and a single white rose. In the faint scent of his cologne that lingered on the locket she wore around her neck, the one Carol had given her, containing a tiny picture of them from their final dance. In the weight of the letter tucked inside her bouquet, the last words her father had written to her. But he wasn't here. Not really. She took a deep breath, willing the lump in her throat to disappear. He wouldn't want me to cry. He made me promise I wouldn't let grief overshadow today. Beside her, Chief Wallace stood tall in his full-dress uniform, his presence both comforting and bittersweet. When she had asked him to walk her down the aisle in her father's place, he had barely managed to hold back his own emotions. "You sure about this kid?" he asked now, his deep voice rough with emotion. "I'm not exactly a replacement." Rachel turned to him, offering a small, wavering smile. "You were his best friend, his partner. He'd want you here." Wallace nodded, straightening his shoulders. "All right then, let's get you married." The doors swung open and the murmur inside quieted instantly. Rachel inhaled sharply as all eyes turned toward her, but her focus was on one person, Ethan. He stood at the altar, hands clasped in front of him, eyes locked on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. There was no nervousness in his expression, no hesitation, only love, and something deeper, something that said, "I see your pain, and I'm here to carry it with you." The first step was the hardest, but as she moved forward, Chief Wallace steady at her side, something shifted. The weight on her chest didn't disappear, but it became bearable. She had made it. At the altar, Wallace turned to Ethan, gripping his shoulder. "You take care of her, son." Ethan met his gaze with unwavering certainty. Always. Rachel barely heard the officiant's words. She knew there were vows spoken, rings exchanged, but all she could focus on was the moment Ethan slid her father's wedding band onto his finger, the same ring James had worn through every trial, every joy. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a promise, a legacy. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife and Ethan leaned in to kiss her, Rachel closed her eyes and let herself feel it. The warmth, the love, the quiet certainty that even in loss, there was still so much to hold on to. As they walked down the aisle together, hand in hand, she glanced toward the front row. The empty chair. She could almost hear his voice. "Head high, kid. You're doing just fine." The reception was everything they had planned. Beautiful, joyful, filled with love. But as the evening wore on, Rachel knew the hardest moment was still ahead. The father-daughter dance. She had debated skipping it altogether. The thought of standing alone on that dance floor, the absence of her father glaringly obvious, had seemed unbearable. But Ethan had held her hands that morning, his voice steady as he reminded her, "You don't have to do this alone." He made sure of that. And so, when the time came, she stood in the center of the room, a microphone in her hand, steadying herself against the way her heartbeat pounded in her ears. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice soft but sure. "This has been the most incredible day, but it's also been a hard one. Some of you knew my dad, some of you only knew of him, but if you did, You know how much he loved a good dance." A soft chuckle rippled through the crowd. Rachel took a shaky breath. "He always promised me that on my wedding day, he'd be there to dance with me. And in a way, he still is." She turned, nodding toward the large screen set up beside the dance floor. The lights dimmed, and as the first notes of Unforgettable played through the speakers, the screen flickered to life. A hush fell over the room. The video played, her father in their living room, standing tall despite the pain, his hand outstretched as he asked for one last dance, her dress swirling around them, the small, bittersweet smile on his face, the way he had whispered, "That's my girl," just before the song ended. Rachel felt Ethan's hand slip into hers as the room blurred with tears. She wasn't the only one crying. Guests wiped at their eyes. Carol held a tissue to her face, and even Chief Wallace, the toughest man she knew, swallowed hard as he stared at the screen. When the video faded to black, a single spotlight illuminated the dance floor. Rachel closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and stepped forward. She moved as if he was still there, as if his hand still guided her, as if the warmth of his presence still surrounded her, and maybe, just maybe, it did. When the music ended, the room erupted into quiet applause, but Rachel didn't turn to acknowledge them. She just closed her eyes, whispering, "Thank you, Dad, for everything." Later, after the cake had been cut, the toasts given, and the guests had begun to filter out into the night, Rachel stepped outside for a moment of quiet. Ethan found her sitting on the stone steps of the venue, her dress pooled around her, her fingers tracing the locket at her throat. "You okay?" he asked, settling beside her. Rachel let out a slow breath. "I think so." Ethan didn't say anything, just took her hand in his, rubbing his thumb gently over her skin. Rachel glanced up at the sky, the stars shining down like tiny, distant promises. "I keep thinking about what he said," she murmured. "How some moments get etched into your soul." Ethan squeezed her hand. "This is one of them." She nodded. "Yeah, it is." For a long moment, they just sat there, the night air cool against her skin, the distant laughter of guests echoing from inside. Then, suddenly, Rachel laughed, a real, genuine laugh that startled even her. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What?" She shook her head, biting her lip. "My dad told me to save him a piece of wedding cake in the freezer." She snorted. "He said if he ever got the chance to haunt me, he'd want cake." Ethan grinned. "So, should we?" Rachel grinned back. "Oh, absolutely." And as they sat there, under the quiet expanse of the night sky, Rachel realized something. Her father was right. Some moments really did last forever. Rachel hadn't realized how much exhaustion had settled into her bones until she and Ethan arrived at their hotel suite that night. The wedding had been perfect, beautiful in ways she never could have imagined, bittersweet in ways she had always known it would be. But now, with the reception behind them, the lights dimmed and the city skyline glittering through the window, reality settled in. She was married. She should have been floating, lost in the euphoric glow of newlywed bliss. And in some ways, she was. But there was also the weight of everything she had carried to this moment. The quiet ache in her chest that reminded her someone, had been missing. Ethan had barely let go of her since they left the venue, sensing the quiet storm brewing inside her. Now, as she sat on the edge of the bed, still in her wedding dress, he knelt in front of her, reaching for her hands. "You okay?" he asked softly. Rachel nodded, but the motion felt too automatic. She exhaled, pressing her fingers against her temples. It just feels surreal, she admitted. Ethan watched her for a moment before brushing his thumb gently over her knuckles. Want to talk about it? Rachel hesitated, then let out a shaky laugh. I keep thinking about the letter. Ethan tilted his head. The one from your dad? She nodded, reaching for her clutch where she had tucked it away earlier. The envelope was slightly crumpled from how tightly she had held onto it throughout the day, her father's familiar handwriting etched across the front. She traced the letters with her fingertips. I wanted to read it before the ceremony, but I wasn't ready. Ethan squeezed her hand. Then let's read it now. Rachel swallowed hard, her heart thudding as she carefully opened the envelope, unfolding the letter inside. The paper was smooth beneath her fingers, the ink bold but familiar. She took a slow breath and began to read. My dearest Rachel, if you're reading this, it's your wedding day, and I'm watching from somewhere better than the front row. Rachel let out a soft, broken laugh, her vision already blurring. I wish more than anything that I was there beside you, cracking jokes to calm your nerves, trying not to cry as I walk you down the aisle. But even though I'm not physically there, I need you to know I am with you. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her shoulders trembling. Ethan squeezed her other hand. Keep going, he whispered. Rachel nodded, blinking rapidly before continuing. You were always the best thing I ever did, kid. From the moment you came into this world, screaming like you had an important speech to give, I knew you were going to be someone extraordinary. And look at you now. A nurse, a wife, a woman who carries so much love in her heart that it humbles me. Rachel let out a shaky breath. Damn it, Dad. Ethan pulled her closer, resting his forehead against the side of her head as she kept reading. I know today is hard. I know you're feeling the weight of my absence. And I won't lie to you, I feel it too. But here's what I need you to do for me, Rachel. When you walk down that aisle, hold your head high. When you say your vows, say them with your whole heart. And when it's time for the father-daughter dance, don't be sad, because we already had our moment, remember? Our last dance in the living room with unforgettable playing. That was enough for me. Rachel bit her lips so hard she nearly tasted blood. So dance tonight, sweetheart. Not with grief, not with sadness, but with love. Because that's what I'll be doing, wherever I am. Loving you. Always. And when life gets hard, because it will, remember this. You are the strongest person I know. And you are not alone. Not today, not ever. I love you, Rachel. Always have, always will. Death. Rachel barely realized she was crying until Ethan pulled her fully into his arms, his grip warm and solid around her. She clutched the letter against her chest, her body shaking as she buried her face against his shoulder. For a long time they just sat there, wrapped in silence, in grief, in love. When Rachel finally pulled back, she wiped at her eyes, letting out a breathy laugh. Well, she sniffed, that ruined my makeup. Ethan chuckled, brushing a thumb against her cheek. You're still the most beautiful bride I've ever seen. Rachel smiled. A real, full smile. The ache in her chest was still there, but so was something else. Warmth. Peace. A quiet acceptance. She glanced down at the letter, smoothing the paper carefully before folding it and placing it back in the envelope. "I think I'm ready to dance now." Ethan's brow lifted. "Right now?" She nodded. "Right now." Ethan stood, offering his hand. "Then let's dance." Rachel took it, allowing him to pull her up. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his playlist before setting it on the nightstand. The first notes of Unforgettable drifted through the room. Rachel let out a soft, surprised laugh. "You had it ready?" Ethan shrugged, pulling her close. "I knew we'd need it." And so, in the quiet glow of their hotel suite, Rachel danced. Not with sadness, not with lust, but with love, because that was what her father had left her. And that was what she would carry forward. Rachel never forgot the feeling of that dance. The way Ethan held her, steady and sure, as if he understood that this moment wasn't just about the two of them. It was about carrying forward the love that had shaped her entire life. She closed her eyes as they swayed to the familiar melody, letting herself believe, just for a moment, that her father was there too. And maybe, in a way, he was. The honeymoon was beautiful, a small coastal town where the waves kissed the shore in rhythmic whispers, where Rachel and Ethan could breathe after months of planning, grieving, and holding themselves together for everyone else. For the first time in what felt like forever, Rachel allowed herself to just be. They walked along the beach in the mornings, spent lazy afternoons reading on the balcony, and in the evenings, they talked about everything and nothing, letting the world shrink down to just the two of them. But grief has a way of sneaking in even when you least expect it. One evening, as they watched the sunset from the patio of a small cafe, Rachel found herself reaching for her phone, her fingers hovering over her father's contact before she caught herself. For years, she had texted him about everything. A beautiful view, a funny story, a random thought. He had always been the first person she shared things with. She stared at the screen, at the name Dad glowing back at her, and then, with a deep breath, she typed, "You'd love it here. The sunsets are unreal. Miss you." She hesitated for only a second before pressing send, knowing full well the message would never be delivered. But that wasn't the point. She just needed to say it. Ethan noticed, but he didn't say anything. He simply reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together as the last streaks of sunlight dipped below the horizon. Rachel exhaled slowly. Maybe this was what healing looked like. Not forgetting, but learning how to carry love forward even in absence. Life didn't stop for grief. Rachel returned to work 2 weeks later, stepping back into the chaos of the emergency room, where there was no time to dwell on sorrow. Patients needed care, crises unfolded, and the world kept spinning, whether she was ready or not. She thought it would be harder, walking into the hospital without thinking about the last time she had rushed through those doors, panic tightening in her chest as she searched for her father. But instead, she found herself comforted by the familiar rhythm of it all. She had always been her father's daughter, after all. And if there was one thing James Parker had taught her, it was how to keep moving forward. Still, some days were harder than others. The first Father's Day without him was unbearable. Rachel woke up early, her chest tight, her mind instinctively drifting to their old Sunday tradition, breakfast at Tony's Diner, just the two of them, laughing over terrible coffee and even worse jokes. She didn't want to spend the day trapped in sadness, but she also couldn't pretend it didn't hurt. So instead of avoiding it, she embraced it. She baked. It was something her father had never been particularly good at. Cooking is for people who can't get takeout, he used to joke. But on rare occasions he had tried. And his absolute favorite thing in the world had been chocolate chip cookies. So Rachel spent the afternoon in the kitchen, flour dusting her apron, the scent of vanilla and melted chocolate filling the apartment. When the cookies were done, she packed them into a tin and drove to the fire station. Chief Wallace met her at the door, his gruff expression softening the moment he saw her. "Thought you might be coming by today," he said, stepping aside to let her in. Rachel set the tin on the counter. Dad's tradition. I figured I'd keep it going. The guys at the station welcomed her like family, swapping stories about her father between bites of cookies, their laughter ringing through the room. It was bittersweet, knowing he wasn't there, knowing he should be, but it also felt right. As she left, Chief Wallace patted her shoulder. "You know, kid, your dad was proud of you long before you were a nurse, long before the wedding, before all of it." He shook his head. "He was proud of you just for being you." Rachel blinked against the sudden sting in her eyes. "Thanks, Chief." She drove home that night feeling lighter, as if, somehow, she had brought a piece of her father back for just a little while. October 20th, their first anniversary. Rachel and Ethan spent the morning in quiet reflection, sipping coffee on their balcony, wrapped in blankets as the autumn breeze swept through the city. Later, they visited her father's grave. She brought flowers. White roses, just like the one that had rested on his chair at the wedding. She knelt beside the headstone, tracing the carved letters with her fingertips. "I kept my promise, Dad." She smiled faintly, setting the flowers down. "I danced." Ethan stood beside her, silent but steady. After a long moment, Rachel exhaled and reached into her bag, pulling out a small container wrapped in foil. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Is that what I think it is?" Rachel grinned. "Saved him a piece of wedding cake." Ethan let out a breathy laugh. "You really did it." "Of course I did." She placed the foil-wrapped cake beside the flowers, patting the top of the headstone lightly. "Told you I would." They stood there for a while, the wind rustling the leaves, the sky, painted in warm streaks of orange and gold. And for the first time in a long time, Rachel felt something close to peace. As the years passed, the grief never fully disappeared. But it changed. It became something softer, quieter, woven into the fabric of her life, rather than something that tore through it. She still visited the fire station every Father's Day, bringing cookies, just like her dad had once done. She still sent texts to his old number, messages that no one would ever read, but that made her feel like she was still telling him about her life. And on the day her son was born, as she held him in her arms for the first time, she whispered his name with a quiet, unshakable certainty. John Parker Carter. Ethan pressed a soft kiss to her temple. He'd love that. Rachel smiled down at their son, her heart full in a way that it hadn't been in a long time. Some moments are etched into your soul. Her father had told her that once. And now, as she rocked her baby in her arms, she knew it was true. Because love never leaves. Not really. It simply changes form. And that was the most beautiful thing of all. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. It means more than you know. At its heart, this isn't just a story about love and loss. It's about cherishing the moments we have while we have them. Life is unpredictable. Time is fleeting. And too often we wait for the perfect moment to say the things that matter, to create memories with the people we love. But the truth is, the perfect moment is now. Rachel's journey teaches us that even when we lose someone, their love never truly leaves us. It stays in the traditions we carry on, in the lessons they taught us, and in the way we live our lives moving forward. Love doesn't end with goodbye. It simply takes a different form. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Do you have a memory with a loved one that you hold close to your heart? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to connect with you. And if this story touched you, make sure to subscribe for more heartfelt and meaningful stories. Let's create a space where we remind each other to treasure the moments that truly matter. Until next time, cherish today, because tomorrow is never promised.